If it ain't Baroque, don't fix it. Hey there, students. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the Baroque, which was an art movement in the 17th and early 18th century, which comes after the Renaissance, before the Enlightenment, Neoclassicism, and all of that. Its origins, like Renaissance art, were in Italy. In the historical context, we really have two historical movements that are associated with the Baroque. First, the Counter-Reformation, and second, absolutism. This art was created for turbulent times. If you think about the Renaissance, this is all about finding these classical texts and studying them and, all nerding out. And really, Renaissance art is a lot like that. But then we think about the entrance of the Reformation and the wars of the Reformation, the 30 Years' War, which brought about unprecedented destruction in Europe. Now, of course, there was the Black Plague, but I mean, as far as like warfare and all that, you see what I'm getting at. So, as far as the Baroque tradition, it represents a rejection of Renaissance restraint. If we look at the School of Athens, we see here this very technically perfect painting from the Renaissance where it looks like it could have been posed for, where it's just like, okay, everybody's in there, now everybody be still and just stop, okay? Kind of like you're doing a mannequin challenge or something like that. And that's Renaissance art. Restraint, that you are supposed to think about balance in the composition, and you're supposed to hold something back. Renaissance art was not very emotional. One thing we need to note here, while this painting of Aeneas fleeing burning Troy, while it's not restrained. You see here all of the running around, you see stuff burning, you see that it's not balanced, you see action, but at the same time, you still see this framework of classical themes. So when we're looking at Baroque art, we're still going to see themes that are very predominantly religious or grounded in the Greco-Roman classical tradition. A few buzzwords when I think about Baroque art are, first of all, motion. So, as I said, like the Renaissance art, you see stillness. In Baroque art, you see motion represented as if somebody just walked by something that was going on and snapped a candid shot, not so much something that's posed for. Emotion. So not only motion, but also emotion. There is less restraint in Baroque art, and there is more of an emotional feel to it. Turbulence. Now notice here I'm breaking some rules of capitalization because Baroque art challenged these existing rules of symmetry and all of that. Grandeur. One thing about the Baroque is everything about it communicated grandeur. It's made in this grand style, and so that's why the Catholic Church and the Absolutists used Baroque art in order to prop up their reputation, to show off their wealth, to show off their grandeur. And finally, contrast, especially when we look at the work of Caravaggio and people who were influenced by him, then we're going to see that there is quite a light and dark thing. Whereas if you look at the Renaissance art, you see that it's pretty much bright throughout. So we're going to look at some of Caravaggio's work in just a bit. And really, if we want it just in one word or phrase, when you think about Baroque art, it represents an embrace of the extra. When we see this here, we see Saint Michael trampling the devil, and you see this action sequence, you see the emotion here, you see the devil suffering, you see that Saint Michael is about to drive his sword into him. I mean, you really, if you look at this closely enough, you can see the raw impact here. It's not just set up for looks or something like that. I mean, you can feel what is going on here. So bling it on. Don't be afraid to be extra if you're a Baroque artist. When you look here, St. Ignatius of Loyola depicted in all of his blinging glory. So let's go ahead and start looking at Baroque paintings, starting with Caravaggio, my favorite Baroque painter. Now, you see here the crowning of thorns, and when you look here, nobody is looking at the camera. This is right here in a moment of action. It's, of course, very intense, and when you think about the Counter-Reformation, this is something here that Catholicism really emphasizes the passion of Christ, the crucifixion of Christ. And so what we see here is Jesus being crowned with thorns. Now, another thing to note is that Jesus is not depicted as ideal. Caravaggio liked to use real figures. Notice that Jesus is not ripped or anything like that. He's just got the body of a normal guy. So Caravaggio wanted to depict things in a grand style, but also when it came to the human body, presenting the human body as it really is and not how it would appear ideally. We see here St. Jerome. Now, if we were looking at Renaissance art, he would be ripped. But the thing is, he's an old man. And in fact, an old man who's about to die, as you see with the skull there, memento mori, remember your death. All right, remember that one day you are going to die, which is, of course, another thing that Christians are told to be mindful of. And so we see St. Jerome here looking as he really would have looked. Now, once again, look at the contrast. It looks as if there's a spotlight shining on St. Jerome here. Then we see David with the head of Goliath. Now, you see here that there is not a shyness about depicting blood or gore. You see that Goliath's head is all bloody. You've got blood kind of coming out of that, and David is looking at it, and then Goliath's just like, oh, this is maybe like, some of you when you've got an exam on this or something like that. But this is Baroque art. Once again, David, you see, is not depicted as anatomically perfect or anything like that. He's depicted as a normal guy who just killed a man. And speaking of killing people, now this is a very intense painting of Judith beheading Holofernes. Now, speaking of Catholicism, this is something that would appear in a Catholic Bible in the Old Testament, what are called the deuterocanonical books or apocryphal books that don't appear in Protestant Bibles. But there's a story here about Judith who attracted an Assyrian officer, Holofernes, and then she killed him. Now, note here that, Renaissance art doesn't really show spattering blood. And then we see the look on this guy's face like, oh, she cut my head off. Actually, he's probably not making any noise because she's probably already cut into his voice box. And gosh, look at those forearms. I guess they're still using male models at this point. Any guy would be jealous, huh? Very muscular. Now, then we see that she's very uncertain. It's like, am I doing this right? And then there is the maid there, an old woman, passively looking on as this is happening. And this is important because we're going to contrast this in just a second. Now, again, note the lights and the darks, the spotlight sort of effect here. So we see here a moment of action and emotion, which is very much present in Baroque painting, and you're not going to find this in Renaissance art. So when we compare this, if we look at Caravaggio's artistic interpretation of this story compared with Lucas Cranach, the Elder, we see here in this Renaissance version, this head of Holofernes is just sitting there. I guess, is it sitting on velvet? Or is that his neck? I can't really tell. But at the same time, you don't see anything gory. She's got the sword there, which suggests that she just killed him. But then again, killing a guy isn't stopping Judith from getting her glow up. We see here that she is really glowing up, and it's not really that emotional. It's just like, so what? I just killed a guy. You want to make something of it? I don't want to challenge this woman, but at the same time, we don't really see the intense action or emotion that we see in Caravaggio's painting. And so let's look at a woman's interpretation of the same thing. This is a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. And this is the same event, and you can tell that it is somewhat based on Caravaggio's, but it's a much more intense perspective. Caravaggio had blood spattering, but here you actually see blood on the sheet. Extremely intense. And so you have to know Artemisia Gentileschi's story to really appreciate this painting and the raw emotion that went into it. Artemisia Gentileschi was the daughter of a painter, and she was the first woman to be admitted into the Academy of Fine Arts in Florence. Now, The tragedy of Gentileschi, which really impacted her work, was that as a young woman, she was raped by the man who was hired to be her tutor. She actually pressed charges. She and her father pressed charges, and there was a 7-month trial. And during this trial, Gentileschi was tortured with thumb screws, this device here that can crush your fingers and toes. And the point here was to test the veracity of her testimony against her rapist. So a woman in this period, in this place, in early modern Italy, if she were to accuse a man of raping her in order to test her testimony, then she had to be tortured. So magnify all of these things here, that she was raped by a man who went on to dishonor her by not marrying her. She had to endure a 7-month trial. She had to endure torture and public scorn and all of these other things that went into this painting. And so let's take a closer look here. Now we see here that Judith and her maid are beheading Holofernes. Now this here is the face of her rapist. She has put him here. And so when you look at this painting and then you look at the two women here and you compare this to Caravaggio's painting, now note here that the maid is much younger here, and the maid is also taking an active role in what's going on. Let me help you. And so this is really, when you look at this, these are two young women who are, cutting off the head of the metaphorical patriarchy. This is revenge art. You see here in this look on this guy's face, in the blood on the sheets, everything about this painting is emotional and intense. And if you like what you've seen so far, I would invite you to continue on with the next segment, which will focus on Baroque sculpture and architecture. See you in a bit.